Some miracles do not arrive with angels. They arrive wearing familiar eyes. On the 20th anniversary of the day the world told him to let go, Ethan Walker drove the same lonely highway before sunrise with a bouquet of fresh, white lilies resting on the passenger seat beside him. The old pickup truck moved steadily beneath rows of towering maple trees whose autumn leaves glowed deep shades of crimson and gold against the pale morning sky. Cedar Ridge remained quiet, wrapped in the peaceful silence that always arrived before the town fully awakened. Every year, Ethan followed the same ritual, without fail, because grief had become less like a wound and more like a faithful companion walking beside him through the seasons. 20 years earlier, he had buried the future he believed he would spend with Emily, yet not a single October had passed without him stopping at the small florist on Main Street before making the drive to the hillside cemetery overlooking the valley. He had never remarried. He had never taken their wedding photograph down from the fireplace. He had never stopped carrying the simple gold wedding band inside the left pocket of his faded denim jacket. Love, he believed, was not measured by how long someone remained beside you. It was measured by whether your heart still chose them after life had given you every reason to surrender. The cool morning breeze carried the distant sound of church bells across the rolling hills, while soft mist drifted between rows of white marble headstones. Ethan stepped through the old wrought iron gate with slow, familiar footsteps, greeting the elderly groundskeeper with nothing more than a respectful nod. Words had never been necessary here. The groundskeeper understood that some visitors came to speak, while others came simply to remember. Gravel crunched softly beneath Ethan's worn work boots as he approached the place he had visited every year for 2 decades. He was already rehearsing the quiet conversation he always shared with Emily when something unusual caught his attention. 3 figures stood beside her memorial stone. One appeared to be the groundskeeper speaking gently with 2 visitors. The second was a young woman whose long blonde hair moved softly in the autumn wind. The third stood with her back turned toward him, her auburn hair illuminated by the rising sun. Ethan slowed without understanding why his heartbeat had suddenly begun to race. The woman turned around. Time seemed to stop. The bouquet slipped from his hands, scattering white lilies across the grass. Every familiar feature belonged to Emily. The same gentle smile, the same graceful posture, the same emerald eyes that had once promised forever beneath a summer sky. Logic insisted such a thing could not exist, yet every memory inside Ethan's heart rose at once, refusing to believe what reason demanded. Before he could force a single word past his lips, the young woman stepped quietly forward. She looked directly into his face with a mixture of hope, fear, and quiet determination that seemed far older than her years. Ethan stared back instinctively. Then he noticed the one detail that shattered every certainty he had carried for 20 years. Her eyes were not Emily's. They were his, identical in color, shape, and quiet warmth, as though an impossible piece of his own life had somehow been standing patiently beside Emily's memorial all along, simply waiting for him to arrive. For several long moments, Ethan could not force himself to speak. His eyes remained fixed on the young woman standing before him, while the autumn wind carried golden maple leaves across the quiet cemetery. Every instinct told him this meeting could not possibly be real, yet every beat of his heart insisted that something far greater than coincidence had placed her beside Emily's memorial on this particular morning. He slowly bent down and gathered the scattered white lilies from the grass before placing them gently against the polished marble headstone. When he finally stood again, the woman who looked so remarkably like Emily stepped forward with a calm expression filled with quiet compassion. "My name is Hannah Brooks," she said softly. "Emily was my identical twin sister." Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. Emily had once mentioned having a twin during their college years, explaining that difficult family circumstances had separated them while they were still children. They had searched for one another for years before life carried them in different directions. After the accident, Ethan had never heard Hannah's name again. He searched her face carefully. Every familiar feature reminded him of the woman he had loved, yet subtle differences slowly became visible. Hannah carried herself with a slightly different confidence. Her smile was gentler, touched by years of carrying someone else's memories. Ethan finally found his voice. "If you are Hannah, then why have I never seen you before?" Hannah looked toward Emily's memorial before answering. Because I found my sister much too late, and by then she had already spent years preparing for this day. Ethan frowned, unable to understand. Before another question could leave his lips, the young blonde woman stepped quietly forward. She held a weathered leather satchel close against her side, as though protecting something deeply precious. Her eyes never left Ethan's face. There was fear inside them, but there was also hope that had clearly survived many years. "Mr. Walker," she said gently, "I know everything about you." Ethan felt another wave of disbelief. "Have we met before?" She slowly shook her head. "Not the way you mean." The answer only deepened the mystery. Ethan looked from Grace to Hannah and back again. "Then how could you possibly know me?" Grace smiled sadly. "Because my mother spent my entire childhood telling me who you were." Ethan's breathing became uneven. "Who was your mother?" Grace carefully opened her satchel without breaking eye contact. From inside, she removed a worn leather journal tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon. The cover showed years of careful handling, but it had been protected with extraordinary care. She held it toward Ethan with both hands, almost like someone returning a priceless family treasure. "She asked me to place this into your hands only after I became certain that your heart was still the same one she remembered." Ethan accepted the journal with trembling fingers. The leather felt strangely familiar before he even opened it. He glanced down and noticed faint initials, pressed into one corner of the cover. They were the same initials he had once stamped into a notebook as a birthday gift for Emily more than 20 years earlier. Grace took one slow breath before speaking the words that made the entire world seem to stand still. "Everything you believed happened after the accident was only part of the story. My mother spent the rest of her life trying to finish the part you never had the chance to hear." For several long seconds, Ethan could not bring himself to untie the faded blue ribbon wrapped around the journal. The leather cover rested in his trembling hands with a familiar warmth that seemed to carry the gentle presence of the woman he had loved for half his life. Grace remained quietly beside him, saying nothing, because she understood that some reunions began long before the first page was ever turned. Hannah stepped back respectfully, allowing the soft breeze and distant church bells to fill the silence between them. Ethan finally drew a slow breath and opened the journal. Before he read a single word, his eyes recognized the graceful handwriting flowing across the yellowed paper. Every letter belonged unmistakably to Emily. His heart tightened as memories of quiet evenings returned, when she would sit beside the farmhouse window writing while rain tapped gently against the glass and fresh coffee filled the room. The first page carried a date exactly 1 week after the accident. Ethan slowly began reading. "If these pages ever reach you, then hope has traveled farther than I ever imagined. I cannot remember your face today, but my heart keeps telling me that somewhere there is a man whose kindness made me believe in tomorrow." Ethan lowered the journal for a moment, unable to steady his breathing. Grace watched quietly while the autumn sunlight filtered through the maple branches above them. Hannah gently whispered. She never stopped writing after that first page. Ethan nodded almost without realizing it, and continued reading. Emily described waking inside a small regional hospital after emergency crews transferred her from another county during severe flooding that had disrupted communications throughout the area. Her identification had been lost, and she remained listed temporarily as an unidentified patient while doctors focused on treating her injuries and helping her recover from profound memory loss. She wrote that names disappeared first, then places, then entire years of her life. Yet one feeling refused to disappear. She knew someone loved her deeply, even though she no longer understood who that person was. The following pages described weeks of rehabilitation filled with tiny victories. She remembered the scent of pine trees before she remembered streets. She remembered the sound of church bells before she remembered conversations. She remembered the comfort of holding a warm coffee mug before she remembered the kitchen where she had once stood beside Ethan every morning. Doctors encouraged patience, explaining that memories often returned like scattered pieces of light instead of one complete sunrise. Ethan slowly turned another page. The handwriting became steadier. Emily wrote about meeting Walter and Louise Bennett, the elderly couple who welcomed her into their farmhouse after rehabilitation ended. They offered her a peaceful room, honest work, and patient kindness without expecting answers she could not yet give. Their compassion allowed her to begin rebuilding a life while still searching for the one she had forgotten. Ethan silently thanked two strangers he had never known. Then his eyes reached a single sentence written in darker ink than everything before it. The words seemed almost alive upon the page. Today the doctor smiled before speaking. He told me that I am carrying our child. I still cannot remember your face, but somehow my heart already knows that our daughter deserves to grow up hearing how deeply her father was loved before either of us knew she existed. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward Grace. Neither of them spoke. They no longer needed anyone else to explain what the journal had already begun revealing. The next pages carried the quiet rhythm of hope, returning one memory at a time. Ethan continued reading while the cool October breeze stirred the fallen maple leaves around Emily's memorial, and every sentence seemed to erase another year of painful uncertainty. Grace stood silently beside him with her hands folded together, watching the expression on his face change from disbelief to quiet understanding. Hannah remained a respectful distance away, allowing the journal to speak where words never could. Emily wrote that the months following Grace's birth became the greatest source of strength she had ever known. Although many memories still remained hidden behind the fog of her injury, holding her daughter every morning reminded her that life had not abandoned her. She described Grace's first smile, the gentle sound of her laughter, and the peaceful evenings when Walter and Louise Bennett helped care for the little girl while Emily continued attending therapy sessions. Every week, another small piece of the past slowly returned. A familiar melody drifting through a grocery store reminded her of dancing in the farmhouse kitchen. The smell of engine oil outside a repair shop stirred the image of a smiling man wiping grease from his hands before reaching for hers. The sight of autumn leaves falling across a quiet road awakened the memory of a pickup truck driving beneath golden trees. None of the memories arrived completely, but together they slowly formed a picture that her heart had never truly forgotten. Doctors encouraged patience, explaining that emotional memories often returned before names and faces. Emily trusted the process, writing every recovered detail inside the journal before sleep could steal it away again. Nearly 3 years after the accident, she described the morning everything changed. During a Sunday church service, the congregation began singing the same hymn that had played during her wedding ceremony. Without warning, every missing memory rushed back at once. She remembered Ethan waiting nervously at the altar. She remembered the white farmhouse porch, the old oak tree beside the yard, the tiny heart carved into its trunk, and the promise they made to choose one another every single day for the rest of their lives. She remembered his laugh, his gentle patience, and the way he always placed fresh coffee beside her notebook before leaving for work. Emily wrote that. She cried for nearly an hour after the service ended, not because she had remembered, but because she suddenly understood everything she had lost. She immediately began searching for Ethan. Public records had changed. Addresses were outdated. Phone numbers no longer existed. Walter and Louise helped her write letters, contact agencies, and search neighboring counties, but every trail seemed to end just before reaching him. Time had quietly carried both of them in different directions without either one knowing the other was still alive. Then Ethan reached another page where the handwriting appeared steadier but more reflective. Emily explained that lingering complications from the accident gradually weakened her health, forcing doctors to recommend ongoing treatment before she attempted long-distance travel. She believed recovery would come soon enough to reunite her family. Instead of surrendering to fear, she devoted herself to preparing Grace for the day she would finally meet the father who had unknowingly loved her since before she was born. The final sentence on the page stood alone, written with unmistakable determination. If my strength cannot carry me home, then one day our daughter will carry my love the rest of the way. The pages that followed no longer focused only on Emily's recovery. They became a quiet record of Grace's childhood, written by a mother determined to make sure her daughter would grow up knowing the father she had never met. Ethan turned each page slowly, careful not to miss a single word that had waited 20 years to find him. Emily described Grace's first smile, her first steps across the wooden floor of the Bennett farmhouse, and the countless evenings when the little girl would ask why other children had fathers waiting outside school, while hers lived only in stories. Emily never answered with bitterness. Instead, she spoke about Ethan with the same warmth she had carried before the accident. She wrote that he was a man who believed promises mattered, who stopped to help strangers without expecting thanks, who always repaired broken things instead of replacing them, and who never allowed disappointment to harden his heart. Grace listened quietly while Ethan continued reading. Those stories had become the foundation of her childhood. She had never doubted that somewhere beyond the miles lived a father whose character was even more important than his name. Emily explained that every birthday she added another letter, another photograph, another memory to the growing collection she hoped Ethan would one day receive. She carefully preserved wedding pictures, handwritten recipes, holiday cards, and small keepsakes from the life they had once shared together. Nothing was thrown away because every object carried a piece of the family Grace deserved to know. Ethan paused when he reached a photograph tucked carefully between two pages. It showed Emily holding a little blonde girl beneath a large oak tree outside the Bennett farmhouse. Grace smiled softly. "That was my 7th birthday," she whispered. Ethan looked more closely. Hanging from one of the branches was a homemade wooden swing almost identical to the one he had built years earlier outside his own farmhouse. Emily had written beneath the picture, "She loves swings just like her father." Ethan gently brushed his fingertips across the faded ink before continuing. The journal described evenings when Emily and Grace would sit together on the porch watching fireflies appear across the fields while Emily told stories about Cedar Ridge, the little garage where Ethan worked, the wraparound porch of their farmhouse, the smell of fresh coffee before sunrise, and the maple trees that turned brilliant shades of red every October. Grace confessed that she had memorized every detail long before she ever visited the town. It already felt like home because her mother had painted it with words throughout her entire childhood. Near the end of the chapter, Emily's handwriting became more deliberate. She explained that her health had gradually become less predictable, forcing her to prepare for every possible future. She made Grace promise never to search for Ethan out of anger, guilt, or obligation. Instead, she asked her daughter to find him only when she felt ready to discover the kind of man he had become. "If life has remained kind to him," Emily wrote, "you will recognize him long before you tell him your name. Goodness cannot hide forever. It reveals itself in ordinary days." Ethan slowly closed the journal for a moment and looked toward Grace. She lowered her eyes before quietly admitting, "That is why I moved to Cedar Ridge 3 years ago. Mother wanted me to meet your character before I ever introduced myself, and every day I watched, you proved that she had remembered you exactly as you truly were." Grace lowered her eyes after speaking, as though she had finally released a burden she had carried for most of her life. Ethan remained silent, unable to decide whether the ache inside his heart came from the years they had lost or the extraordinary gift that had somehow survived them. The autumn wind drifted gently through the cemetery, carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves while distant church bells marked another peaceful Sunday morning. Hannah stepped closer and quietly placed a comforting hand on Grace's shoulder before looking at Ethan with understanding. "Emily hoped this moment would happen exactly like this," she said softly. Ethan looked back at the journal resting in his hands. "She truly believed Grace should wait before meeting me?" Hannah nodded. "She believed character reveals itself through ordinary days, not extraordinary moments." Grace took a slow breath before continuing. "I moved to Cedar Ridge 3 years ago after graduating from college. I accepted a teaching position at the elementary school because it allowed me to build a life here without attracting attention." Ethan listened carefully while memories quietly began fitting together inside his mind. Grace smiled gently. "You repaired the school maintenance truck twice. Every time you refused to charge us for little things that you said only required kindness instead of money." Ethan remembered the young teacher who always thanked him with homemade cookies for the shop. He had never imagined she knew exactly who he was. Grace continued speaking. "During my first winter here, I watched you spend an entire Saturday fixing a widow's furnace because she could not afford a repair company. In the spring, I saw you rebuild a little boy's bicycle after it had been damaged, and you never accepted a single dollar from his family. Every Thanksgiving you delivered food to people who believed no one remembered them. Mother told me goodness would never need an audience. She was right." Ethan slowly shook his head. "You were there all that time." Grace nodded. "Almost every week." She reached inside the satchel once more and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope whose edges had softened with age. Across the front, written in Emily's unmistakable handwriting, appeared only 2 words. For Ethan. Ethan accepted the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing the delicate curve of every letter before he even unfolded it. A faint scent of dried lavender still lingered within the paper, instantly carrying him back to evenings when Emily tucked pressed flowers inside birthday cards and anniversary notes. Grace smiled through quiet tears. She wrote that letter during the final months of her life. She asked me never to open it because every word belonged only to you. Ethan carefully unfolded the pages while sunlight filtered through the maple branches above them. Before reading further, he glanced once more at Grace. For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, he no longer saw a stranger standing beside Emily's memorial. He saw his daughter patiently carrying 20 years of love across the silence, and somehow that realization felt even greater than the miracle that had brought them together. He lowered his eyes to the first line of Emily's letter, and after one steady breath, he began to read. The letter trembled slightly in Ethan's hands as he unfolded the first page with the same care he had once used when opening every birthday card Emily had ever written. The familiar handwriting immediately carried him back to another lifetime, one filled with quiet mornings, shared dreams, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow would always arrive with the woman he loved beside him. He took a slow breath before reading the first line. My dearest Ethan, if these words have finally reached you, then our daughter has completed the journey I prayed she would one day have the strength to make. Ethan paused, pressing his lips together while the autumn breeze gently lifted the corner of the letter. Grace remained beside him without speaking. She had honored her mother's final request by never reading the letter herself. Every word belonged only to the man Emily had never stopped loving. Ethan continued reading. Emily explained that after her memories fully returned, she often imagined walking through the front door of their farmhouse and finding Ethan exactly where she had left him, repairing something in the garage, or carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee onto the porch before sunrise. Those simple dreams gave her strength during treatments and difficult days. Although her health slowly became more uncertain, she refused to let fear become the story Grace inherited. Instead, she filled their home with gratitude, laughter, family traditions, and stories about the quiet goodness of the man waiting somewhere beyond the miles. Please never believe that time erased you from my heart, she wrote. Every birthday candle Grace blew out carried a silent wish that somehow we would find our way back to you. Ethan carefully wiped away a tear before it reached the paper. Grace lowered her eyes, remembering birthdays when her mother always paused for one extra moment after the candles were extinguished. She had never understood why until now. The letter continued with remarkable peace rather than sorrow. Emily asked Ethan not to measure their lives by everything they had lost, but by everything love had protected despite the years apart. She thanked him for teaching her that kindness was never wasted, because even unseen acts of goodness continued shaping lives long after they were forgotten. She believed those lessons would eventually guide Grace toward the father she had never known. Hannah quietly looked toward the rows of maple trees surrounding the cemetery while church bells echoed across the valley once more. Ethan reached the final page. Emily's handwriting had become slightly weaker, yet every word remained steady. If Grace is standing beside you today, then please welcome her without regret. She has already carried enough questions for one lifetime. Give her the home I described. Show her the porch swing, the old oak tree, and the little kitchen where we once believed every dream was possible. Let her discover that family is not measured by the years we missed, but by the love we choose from this moment forward. Ethan slowly folded the letter and placed it carefully inside the journal before looking directly at Grace. For several quiet seconds, neither of them moved. Then he extended his hand toward her with a gentle smile that carried 20 years of longing and one brand new beginning. Come with me, he said softly. There is a place your mother never stopped calling home, and I think it has been waiting for you just as patiently as I have. The drive from the cemetery to Cedar Ridge unfolded beneath a sky painted with soft shades of amber and pale blue, while golden maple leaves drifted across the quiet country road like memories finally finding their way home. Ethan kept both hands resting gently on the worn steering wheel of his old pickup truck, glancing only occasionally toward Grace, who sat quietly beside him with the weathered journal resting safely on her lap. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with conversation. After 20 years of unanswered questions, their quiet companionship already spoke more honestly than words ever could. Hannah followed several minutes behind in her own car, choosing to give father and daughter the private beginning Emily had always hoped they would share. As the familiar gravel driveway appeared beyond a line of towering oak trees, Grace slowly drew in her breath. Every detail before her matched the countless stories her mother had lovingly repeated throughout childhood. The white farmhouse stood exactly as she had imagined. The wraparound porch welcomed the afternoon sunlight. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the porch roof, filling the peaceful air with the same delicate melody Emily had once described while telling bedtime stories. Ethan parked the truck and stepped outside before walking around to open Grace's door. She looked toward the house for several long moments before whispering. She remembered everything. Ethan smiled. Gently. She always noticed the little things. Together they crossed the front yard until Grace stopped beneath the enormous oak tree standing beside the porch. She reached toward the weathered trunk almost instinctively, tracing the rough bark with careful fingertips before finding the faded heart carved into the wood decades earlier. Inside the worn outline remained two weathered initials that time had softened but never erased. Emily had described that carving so many times that Grace recognized it immediately without searching. Ethan laughed quietly through grateful tears. I carved that the summer I asked your mother to marry me. Grace smiled as she rested her hand beside the carving. She always said you worried it looked uneven. Ethan shook his head with quiet disbelief. She remembered even that. They walked inside together as warm afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, filling every room with a peaceful golden glow. The grandfather clock continued marking each passing second just as faithfully as it had throughout the years Ethan spent believing he was alone. Family photographs remained carefully displayed across the living room. The stone fireplace still stood at the center of the house, and the old rocking chair beside the window seemed untouched by time. Grace slowly explored the room, recognizing each familiar object long before she had ever seen it with her own eyes. It no longer felt like entering a stranger's home. It felt like stepping into memories she had quietly carried throughout her life. Ethan noticed an empty wooden frame resting above the fireplace mantel. He gently removed the faded wedding photograph from the journal and carefully placed it inside the frame. Together they stood looking at the smiling faces of two young people who once believed forever would arrive exactly as planned. Then Grace knelt beside her satchel and carefully lifted out a small wooden keepsake box wrapped in faded blue ribbon. She placed it softly upon the coffee table before looking toward Ethan with quiet anticipation. Mother asked me never to open this until we were standing together inside this house, she said gently. She believed the final gift should always come home before it revealed its secret. Grace carefully untied the faded blue ribbon surrounding the small wooden keepsake box, while Ethan stood beside her in complete silence. Warm afternoon sunlight filled the farmhouse living room, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor as the gentle sound of wind chimes drifted through the open porch windows. For a moment, neither of them moved. It felt as though the house itself had been waiting 20 years for this final promise to be fulfilled. Inside the box rested a neatly folded linen cloth, several carefully preserved family photographs, a simple silver locket, and a small digital camcorder protected inside a soft fabric pouch. Ethan stared at the camera without speaking. Grace lifted it gently and placed it into his hands. Mother recorded this during the final months of her life, she whispered. She wanted you to hear her voice one last time. Ethan slowly pressed the power button. The screen flickered softly before revealing Emily sitting beneath the great oak tree outside the Bennett farmhouse. Her hair moved gently in the summer breeze while evening sunlight surrounded her with a quiet warmth that instantly filled the room. Although time had changed her face, her peaceful smile remained exactly as Ethan remembered. She looked directly into the camera with calm eyes filled not with sadness, but with gratitude. "Hello, my love," she began softly. Ethan closed his eyes for only a moment as tears quietly escaped despite every effort to remain composed. Grace stood beside him, gently resting one hand upon his arm, while watching the mother she had missed every day since saying goodbye. Emily continued speaking with remarkable peace. "If you are seeing this, then Grace has already found you. and somehow love has traveled farther than either of us believed possible. She smiled gently before continuing. Please do not spend another day wondering whether I ever stopped loving you. I never did. Life separated us in ways neither of us could control, but my heart always remained where it first learned the meaning of home. Ethan listened without blinking, afraid to lose even a single second of her voice. Emily looked briefly toward the oak tree behind her before returning her eyes to the camera. Grace, thank you for carrying hope farther than I ever could. Your father has already loved you for your entire life, even though he did not know where to find you. Trust his heart. It has always been stronger than sorrow. Grace quietly smiled through tears. Emily reached into her pocket and held up the simple gold wedding band Ethan had once believed lost forever. I carried this every single day because promises do not disappear when people are separated. They simply wait for the right moment to bloom again. She slowly slipped the ring onto a ribbon around her neck before speaking one final time. Ethan, show our daughter the porch where we watched sunsets together, the kitchen where we laughed over burned pancakes, the oak tree where we carved our dreams, and every ordinary place that taught us extraordinary love. Do not remember me only for the years we lost. Remember me every time the two of you create a new memory together. The screen slowly faded to black, leaving only peaceful silence inside the farmhouse. Ethan carefully closed the camcorder and looked toward Grace with quiet certainty. Without hesitation, he opened his arms. Grace stepped forward, and father and daughter embraced for the very first time beneath the same roof, where Emily had always believed their family would one day become whole again. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the front porch while the old wind chimes sang softly into the evening, as though the house itself finally recognized that after 20 years of waiting, love had found its way home.